All right. So we're picking up with the central nervous system, which is going to be made up of the brain and the spinal cord. In this video, we're going to focus mainly on the brain. And so the brain receives sensory information coming up and then integrates that and sends out motor stuff away, so the efferent side. When you look at the brain and the spinal cord, you'll see that it's wrapped with 3 meninges. Meninges are layers, insulators of the nervous system. And the outer one, the dura mater, is very, very tough. It's very durable, right? And then as you go in, you get into the arachnoid matter. When you hear arachnoid, what do you think of? I think of spiders and how they have webs. And so when you look at the arachnoid matter, you're going to see that it is this layer that has a lot of like projections across to it and a lot of empty space for cerebral spinal fluid. And then you have the pia mater, which is going to be directly held on to that nervous tissue. It's a really thin layer, similar to like your visceral peritoneum or your visceral pericardium. And so we have our cerebral spinal fluid being made in the ventricles of the brain, but then it circulates. So it comes out of these aqueducts and then it starts to circulate. As it moves around the brain, it drains out of this thing called the dural sinus that you find at the top of the skull. And then it gets back into the venous blood supply and gets drained via the internal jugular artery. Okay, so the brain, here you can see the cerebrum. That's going to be the biggest part of the brain, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. But on the cerebrum, you see that you have these bumps and grooves. This is a gyrus. Those grooves are a sulcus. If you have more than one, it is a gyri and sulci. Back here, you see the cerebellum. Here you can see the pons and the medulla oblongata. This is the corpus callosum, and here's where you'll find your thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary. And we'll go through these and talk about them a little bit more. So let's start with the biggest part, with the cerebrum. This is 80% of your brain mass. So more than half of your brain is made up of this cerebrum. It's also where you find all your higher mental functions. So whenever you're thinking something, that's coming from this cerebrum. It has 2 hemispheres, so if you look at the brain, you'll see you have a right and a left, and they're connected via this corpus callosum. This corpus callosum is made out of white matter, and we'll talk about what white matter is in just a second. But it really connects those 2 halves of your brain. So when we look at the cerebral cortex, you're going to see you're going to have about 2 to 4 millimeters of gray matter. You can see the gray matter here in this picture. Gray matter is the part that has the neuron bodies. So anywhere you see gray matter, you're going to see the somas of neurons. Everything else, all this white matter, this is axon tracts. So these are going to be the axons going from these somas to other places in the brain so they can talk to each other. So looking at the brain, there's a lot of tracts, not a ton of bodies. So you have a little bit of gray matter here on the cerebral cortex. You'll also find some gray matter deeper in the brain with these basal nuclei that we'll talk about. But most of it is white matter, or those axon tracts. So there's no integration, there's no like thought happening there. It's just fibers sending signals. So when you look at the brain, we have 5 lobes. You're going to have your frontal lobe here. If this was a physiology class, we'd talk more about what your frontal lobe does. But you can read a lot of your skeletal motor comes from the frontal lobe, specifically this pre-central gyrus. And then sensory stuff on the post-central gyrus. This is the parietal lobe. So frontal bone, right? Parietal lobe, parietal bones. Back here, occipital lobe, occipital bone. The occipital lobe deals with vision. And then temporal lobe, temporal bones. And then the fifth one, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is an invagination here between the temporal and frontal. And it's called the insula, I-N-S-U-L-A, the insula. And the insula deals with like visceral sensations, so information coming from your organs, from your guts. So how do we know these different parts of the brain? Well, one, we can dissect them, right? But what if the person's still living? Well, we can do stuff like CT scans or X-ray computed tomography, where you can look at the soft tissues in the brain. So it's just basically a whole bunch of X-rays just that cuts through, and then you can look at different areas. So here you can see, again, that cerebral cortex and the cerebrum. Here would be like the thalamus and the diencephalon. Coming down, this is your cerebellum. And then looking at it again, you can see that gray matter on the outside, on the cortex, and then the white matter, the corpus callosum, a ventricle, and then here's the spinal cord coming out and down. But we can also use something else. So this is kind of like in situ. You're not going to see a lot of stuff like happening during this, but you could see things like tumors or fluid-filled spaces or any kind of like structural abnormality you can see with the CT scan. But if you want to look at how the brain is working, you can use a PET scan or a positron emission tomography. And so with this, you have radioisotopes that emit these positrons that are injected into the blood. And so you can see where more blood is going, and that tells you what area of the brain is working more. Because the one that's working more is going to need more energy, and that way it's going to get more blood. And it's a whole complex system about how capillaries know to dilate and constrict and stuff we're not going to get into because it's physiology. So moving down the brain, we can get to these basal nuclei. So we're right here. Here you can see the corpus callosum connecting the two halves. Here's the thalamus, which has some gray matter in it. But then we also have these basal nuclei. And these are important for skeletal muscle control. And so it's going to be getting information from that precentral gyrus, where you come up with what muscles you want to work, and also back from the cerebellum back here, can send some signals up here, and it helps just to coordinate all those muscle movements. And you have your corpus stratum, which is made up of your caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus, and then that lentiform nucleus also has putmins and globus pallidus. So here you can see the globus, putmins, and that's all in that lentiform. Here's the caudate right here, anterior. Back here is your claustrum. All right. And then for emotion and motivation, hopefully you're feeling a lot of motivation to do well in this test coming up, and you might have some emotions of stress. That's going to be coming from this area, which we deem the limbic system. So you have a bunch of forebrain nuclei and some fiber tracts that come down here around the brain stem. And these are your drives for basic emotions. I like to call it the 4 Fs. So it deals with feeding, so like hunger and thirst. It deals with fear. Specifically, the amygdala here is big into fear and what you fear and how you fear. And what reactions you get with fear. So we have feeding fear. You also have fighting. So aggression is set up in this. Sometimes maybe if somebody scares you, you punch them. That's an aggressive move. That's also centered in the limbic system. And then the last one, the fourth one, will be fornicating. So your sexual desires are located in this area. Of course, lots of other things can play into that, dealing with the higher brain centers, but these are basic emotional drives. We have this circuit called the Papez circuit, this closed circuit that starts right here at the fornix, comes down to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is really important in spatial memory and knowing where stuff is. The hippocampus is just really important in memory in general. And we see a lot of degeneration in the hippocampus with people who have like Alzheimer's. So it goes from the fornix down here to the hippocampus, and then over here to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus does a ton of stuff. It releases a bunch of different hormones that then work on the anterior and posterior pituitary to release more hormones. And then a lot of those hormones go to work on other endocrine organs to cause them to release more hormones. But you also have a lot of like osmoregulators and stuff in the hypothalamus that deal with like thirst and hunger and body temperature and a lot of stuff happening right here in the hypothalamus. So we have this little system with the fornix, hippocampus, hypothalamus, going into the thalamus, back to the fornix, and that's called the Papez circuit. So the thalamus, if we were meeting in person and having lab in person, you would get to do a sheep brain dissection today, which is really cool. It's probably like one of my favorite dissections because it does look just like this picture. A lot of times when you do dissections, maybe they don't look as clean, but the sheep brain looks really good. The thalamus is really this relay center, so if you look at it, here's the brain stem, right? So all that information that is coming in from the body comes up to the thalamus. You also have a lot of information coming from your special senses coming through the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends it to where it needs to go in the cerebral cortex. And so it's really like this relay station about where to send different information. And you'll see like your lateral geniculate nuclei relaying visual information, the medial geniculate relaying auditory information, and then your interlamellar doing different sense modalities like taste. It's important in alertness and arousal from sleep. You have these things called reticular fibers that are found in the medulla oblongata through the pons up to the thalamus. And these fibers, when you're going to sleep, so they're activated by histamine. And when they're activated, they're sending signals and you're receiving all this information. But when histamine decreases, those signals start going away. And so it filters out a lot of sensory information. I don't know if you've ever like fallen asleep with like maybe your phone in your hand. And then as you wake up, like you don't even feel your phone in your hand until a little bit later. And then you'll be like, oh, I have my phone. Or maybe you hear your alarm and you're really asleep and you can like barely pick up on something as you're sleeping, and then that pulls you out, and as you're coming out of it, you're like, wow, that's really loud, and I was just barely hearing it. That's because of these reticular fibers or formations found throughout the brainstem and the thalamus. Something else that we find is your epithalamus. So right here, you have this stuff called the choroid plexus, which is going to be made up of a lot of those ependymal cells. And they are going to be making cerebrospinal fluid that goes into the ventricle right here and then circulates throughout the central nervous system. You'll also find your pineal gland here. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, and melatonin is really important in circadian rhythms or wake-sleep cycles. Some of you might take melatonin as a sleep aid. So you have your eyes picking up on light and sends it across to like the super optic chiasma that then sends it up here to the pineal gland. It's like, hey, there's light, don't make melatonin. And as soon as it goes dark, then they get the signal. It's like, okay, make melatonin. And so something that you see if you're having trouble sleeping, a lot of people say don't stare at your phone, don't watch TV, because your eyes are picking up on that light signal and telling your brain not to make melatonin. And then melatonin helps you go to sleep. So we had the epithalamus. We also have the hypothalamus down here. So thalamus, epithalamus, hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, again, we talked about it just a little bit, part of the limbic system, right? So hunger, thirst, body temperature, osmoregulation of your blood, also important in sleep, wakefulness, emotion, sexual arousal, anger, fear, pain, and pleasure. So lots and lots of stuff happening in the hypothalamus. Plus, it's releasing all those hormones that then work on the pineal or the pituitary gland to release its hormones, which are going to go work on other endocrine organs to release their hormones. Stuff that you talk more about in physiology. So the hypothalamus talks down here to the pituitary. The pituitary gland releases a bunch of tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones that work on other endocrine organs. And so you'll have stuff like ATCH or adrenocorticotropic hormone. Growth hormone gets released from here. Prolactin gets released from here. That's important in milk production. What else? Lots of stuff gets released from here. And it also stores some. So the hypothalamus makes a couple of hormones that it sends down to the pituitary to store in the posterior pituitary. It stores stuff like ADH, antidiuretic hormone, aka vasopressin. And it also stores oxytocin, which is important in uterine contractions and bonding relationships. So the pituitary gland secretes a whole lot of different hormones that work across the body. Then moving back to the midbrain here. So here's your pituitary, hypothalamus, thalamus, midbrain. The midbrain has a whole bunch of nuclei in it. So it has this thing called the corpora quadrigemina, and it has a superior and inferior colliculi. So the superior colliculi, you have this optic tract, optic nerve coming. You have a chiasma right here. And then it comes through the midbrain. And the superior colliculi deals with visual reflexes. And then the inferior one is actually important in relaying auditory information or sound information. You also have the substantia nigra here. The substantia nigra is really important in motor control, and in people with Parkinson's, where you get that shaking, we see that the substantia nigra is actually secreting a lot less dopamine, which is important in motor control. You have another thing called the red nucleus. So back here you have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is really important in equilibrium and skeletal muscle control as well. And it sends those signals up to the midbrain and the red nucleus. And its job is to help take that information and consolidate it before you send everything down the spinal cord to carry out whatever that skeletal muscle contraction needs to be. And then we're down to the hindbrain, and this is going to finish the lecture for today. In the hindbrain, you're going to have, here you can see your midbrain, the cerebellum, the arbor vitae in the cerebellum, these white fiber tracts, your pons, and the medulla oblongata. Both of these are really important in carrying out autonomic function. And so you'll see respiratory centers, we talked about those, right? The pneumotaxic, the anoustic region. Down here you have the rhythmacy area for respiratory. The medulla oblongata also has a lot of stuff dealing with heart rate We'll talk about cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, which is really important parasympathetically in slowing down the heart rate that comes out from the medulla oblongata. And with that, we will stop talking about the central nervous system, and we'll pick up with the peripheral nervous system next time.